They called her a joke before she ever touched the throttle of an $80 million fighter jet. A room full of decorated pilots laughed at her crop-dusting boots and her faded flight suit, certain she would wash out within a week. They had no idea that the woman they mocked was about to make every radar screen on that base scream one word, Viper. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Dust rose in thin gold curtains over the flatlands of central Kansas, catching the late afternoon sun as it drifted across a runway that was really just packed dirt and gravel with a windsock nailed to a fence post. The air smelled like diesel, warm hay, and the faint bitterness of pesticide. Somewhere beneath the roar of a tired radial engine, a young woman named Riley Hodges wrestled a Piper Pawnee through a stall speed turn 10 feet above a wheat field, her hands so practiced on the controls that she barely had to think about it anymore. She didn't fly the plane so much as argue with it, correcting for a crosswind gust before her body had even registered the gust existed. Riley had grown up in the back seat of that same crop duster, strapped in beside her grandfather, Earl Hodges, a man who had flown biplanes since before radar was common and who liked to say that an airplane was just a stubborn animal that hadn't decided yet whether it liked you. Earl taught her everything the old way, no simulators, no digital trainers, just raw hours in the air, learning to read a wingtip vortex the way other people read a stop sign. When Earl's hands finally grew too unsteady to fly, 17-year-old Riley took over the family operation, spraying 900 acres before sunrise so the bank wouldn't take the land they'd worked for 3 generations. For 6 years she flew that way, 14-hour days, engines that coughed more than they purred, and a logbook that filled up faster than any classroom ever could. While kids her age were choosing majors and moving into dorm rooms, Riley was memorizing weather patterns and saving every spare dollar toward flight hours she couldn't really afford. She wanted more than dirt runways. She wanted the sky that lived above 30,000 feet, the sky where the air got thin and cold and the curvature of the earth became visible if you looked hard enough. So she applied to officer training school, passed on her 3rd attempt, and 3 years later found herself standing on the blistering tarmac of Nellis Air Force Base, holding a duffel bag and trying not to let her hands shake. Nellis was nothing like anything she had ever known. The hangars alone were larger than every building on her family's farm combined. Fighter jets sat in gleaming rows like sharpened knives, their canopies throwing back the desert sun in blinding flashes. Riley had flown through hailstorms and dust devils without blinking, but walking into that locker room for the first time, she felt something closer to fear than she wanted to admit. The pilots in that squadron were not ordinary people. Most of them had grown up inside the machine, sons and daughters of colonels, academy graduates with legacy rings on their fingers, kids who had been groomed for cockpits since before they could read. The unquestioned leader of the group was Captain Derek Ashford, call sign Talon, a pilot whose family tree read like an Air Force history book. His grandfather had flown Sabres in Korea. His father had flown Eagles over the Gulf. Derek himself had graduated top of his class, and he wore that fact like a second uniform. He noticed Riley the moment she stepped through the door, and he made sure everyone else noticed her too. "Well, would you look at this," Derek said, loud enough to bounce off the tile walls, nudging his wingman, Lieutenant Tom Reyes. "I heard they were pulling recruits from wherever they could find them, but I didn't think that meant tractor country. Tell me something, does the F-35 come with crop dusting mode, or is that an aftermarket upgrade?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Riley kept her hand steady on her locker door and turned to face him, her voice level and unhurried. "No upgrade needed," she said. "I've always been good at handling things that stink." The laughter died instantly. Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment the room went quiet enough that Riley could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. He took a slow step toward her, all traces of humor gone from his face. "You think this is funny," he said. "This isn't some rattling biplane held together with duct tape and prayer. The F-35 processes more information in a second than your whole farm sees in a year. It flies by data, not gut feeling. Gut feeling gets people killed up here. You don't belong in this squadron, and red flag is going to prove it." Before Riley could answer, the squadron commander walked in. Colonel Patricia in Graham was a tall, silver-haired woman with the kind of stillness that made rooms fall quiet on their own. She didn't care about lineage. She cared about performance, and she made that clear in the first 10 seconds she spoke. "Save it for the sky, Captain Ashford," she said. "Simulator integration starts in 10 minutes. Hodges, keep up." "Yes, ma'am," Riley said. As the room emptied, Derek brushed past her hard enough to knock her shoulder against the lockers. "Enjoy the view from the ground, farm girl," he muttered. Riley stood alone for a long moment after the room cleared, staring at her own reflection in the dull metal of her locker door. She thought of the wheat fields back home, of the vibration of an old engine through her hands, of the voice of her grandfather telling her that machines could fail but instinct never did. She closed her eyes, took one long breath, and made herself a quiet promise. She was not going to let this base decide who she was before she'd had the chance to prove it herself. The simulator bay at Nellis looked like something out of a science fiction film, rows of massive dome-shaped pods, each one an exact replica of an F-35 cockpit, wired into systems that could recreate almost any combat scenario in existence. For 3 straight weeks, Riley fought a losing battle against that machine. The jet was not simply an airplane. It was an entire nervous system built from sensors, threat receivers, radar feeds, and infrared tracking, all of it pouring directly into a helmet that projected data straight onto her eyes. She could look down through the floor of the aircraft and see the ground beneath her boots. She could see enemy contacts before they ever became visible to the naked eye. And still, none of it felt real to her. In the crop duster, she had trusted the wind on her face and the pressure in her spine. Here, she was being asked to trust numbers on a screen instead of her own body, and something in her kept resisting. The breaking point came during her final simulated check ride before live red flag missions began. She flew as wingman to Derek, call sign Talon, on a Mach 2 ship patrol into contested airspace. Everything was calm until her threat receiver screamed. 2 hostile aircraft had dropped out of radar cover behind a mountain ridge. "Break right, Hodges, deploy countermeasures, let the system lock them," Derek barked over the radio. But something about the numbers didn't sit right with Riley. The threat was showing 3 miles out in open terrain, but visually the canyon below narrowed sharply, the kind of terrain where breaking right would bleed her airspeed and leave her exposed to a second attacker hiding in the rocks. Every instinct she had ever built flying low over farmland told her the same thing: don't trust the open lane, trust the shape of the land. She rolled the jet instead, diving toward the canyon floor to get a visual read the way she would have back home. It was the wrong call. A simulated missile she never should have flown into caught her mid-maneuver, and her screen flashed the words "aircraft destroyed" in blunt red letters. Back in the debrief, Colonel Ingram stood with her arms folded while Derek delivered his verdict with obvious satisfaction. 50 seconds, he said. "That's how long you lasted. You ignored the sensor picture and tried to dogfight a threat you couldn't even see yet. You're not flying a crop duster anymore, Hodges. Up here, the screen is what keeps you alive." The terrain was tight, Riley said quietly. If there'd been a second aircraft using the ground clutter. "There wasn't," Ingram interrupted, not unkindly but without room for argument. "The sensors were correct. Your job isn't to overrule the aircraft, Lieutenant. Your job is to trust what it's telling you and execute. Tomorrow we begin live flights. If you pull a stunt like that in the air, I will ground you myself." That night, Riley sat alone in the empty briefing room long after everyone else had gone to sleep, running the failed simulation over and over on a laptop screen, the glow illuminating her tired face in the dark. Derek was right about one thing: she had been fighting the jet instead of flying it. But as she watched the data trails loop across the screen for what felt like the 100th time, something shifted in her thinking. She had spent 3 weeks trying to ignore the technology so she could feel the aircraft the old way. But what if that was the wrong question entirely? What if the data wasn't something to override her instincts, but something to feed them? Her grandfather had taught her to listen to the wind. Maybe the jet sensors were just a different kind of wind, one she hadn't learned to listen to yet. She packed up her things as the first hint of dawn touched the desert sky outside the window. Today, there would be no more simulator. Today, she would fly the real aircraft into the harshest training exercise on the planet, and she intended to prove that the girl from the wheat fields wasn't finished yet. Red Flag was not a gentle introduction to combat flying. For 2 weeks, the skies above the Nevada test and training range would fill with live surface-to-air missile simulations, electronic jamming, and an aggressor squadron trained specifically to fly like America's most dangerous potential adversaries. Riley climbed into her assigned F-35 that morning with ice in her stomach and steel in her spine. Derek gave her a mocking thumbs up from the neighboring jet before dropping his own helmet over his head, and she ignored it completely, focusing instead on the quiet ritual of strapping in, connecting her suit to the life support systems, and watching the helmet display flicker to life around her. As her jet screamed down the runway and lifted into a cloudless Nevada sky, Riley made herself a promise. She would stop treating the numbers as noise. She would let them become part of her, the same way the vibration of an old engine had once told her everything she needed to know about a coming stall. 30 minutes into the mission, cruising north over jagged brown mountains with Derek flying lead, the calm shattered. Her threat receiver wailed, not with a clean signal, but with static and ghost contacts flooding her screen all at once. Heavy jamming, Derek called over the radio, his voice clipped. Aggressors are running broad-spectrum interference. Keep tight formation, trust the fused sensor picture. Riley scanned the chaos on her display and noticed something buried beneath the noise, a faint, intermittent blip low on the deck that the system had flagged as unreliable. Derek dismissed it instantly as a jamming artifact and ordered her to disregard it, to keep pushing toward the target. But something about the shape of the terrain below, a narrow canyon carved into shadow, told Riley a different story. It was exactly the kind of place a low-flying aggressor could hide a heat signature against sun-baked rock. "I'm breaking to investigate," she said. "Negative, Hodges, hold formation," Derek snapped. "That's an order." She didn't listen. Rolling the jet onto its back, she dove hard toward the canyon floor, ignoring the alarms warning her about rapid descent. Leveling out at barely 500 feet, she tore through the narrow passage at blistering speed, trusting her eyes over the fractured data on her screen. And there it was, not a ghost track, but a real aggressor aircraft skimming the rocks, completely invisible to Derek's higher altitude sensors, lining up a shot directly beneath him. "Talon, brake right, now. Bandit at your 6, low," Riley shouted. Derek hesitated for one dangerous second, trusting his blank radar screen over her warning, and in that second Riley made her move. She slammed the throttle into afterburner, hauled the jet into a brutal climbing turn, and used nothing but raw instinct to put herself on the aggressor's tail before he ever completed his attack run. A single simulated shot later, the range umpire's voice crackled through the radio confirming a clean kill. High above, Derek finally spotted the retreating aggressor and understood, with a cold jolt, exactly what had almost happened to him. In the debrief that followed, Colonel Ingram replayed the engagement for the entire squadron, showing the moment Riley broke formation and the moment, for seconds later, that Derek's aircraft would have been destroyed had she not intervened. The room that had once laughed at her sat in stunned silence. Later, the legendary aggressor flight lead, a grizzled major everyone called Ghost, walked directly up to Riley after the debrief. "Nobody's ever caught me in that canyon," he said, studying her with new respect. "How'd you know I was there?" "I didn't," Riley admitted. "The terrain just felt wrong. Where I grew up, you learn where the shadows hide the danger." Ghost let out a low laugh and shook his head. "You came out of nowhere and struck like you'd been waiting in the grass the whole time," he said. "Like a viper." Colonel Ingram crossed the call sign off her roster sheet that afternoon and wrote a new one beside Riley's name. From that point forward, whenever anyone in the squadron mentioned Aircraft 42, they used one word only, Viper. The following days tested that new name in ways Riley never expected. During a simulated combat search and rescue mission deep in blacked-out mountain terrain, with Derek now flying as her wingman under Ingram's orders, Riley sensed a trap where the data insisted there was none. When the enemy's jamming abruptly stopped and a downed pilot's beacon appeared with perfect clarity in a valley below, every system on her jet indicated a clean approach. But the sudden silence after non-stop interference felt wrong to her, the same way an unnaturally still field back home had once warned her of a coming storm. She ordered an abort. Derek, driven by the need to redeem himself after the canyon incident, ignored her and pushed ahead into the valley alone, straight into a hidden missile battery that locked onto his aircraft the instant he crossed the threshold. With 3 simulated missiles screaming toward him and no way to outrun them, Riley made the only choice her instincts would allow. She dove directly into the missile envelope herself, deliberately exposing her own aircraft to draw the threat away from his, then killed her engine power completely, letting her jet fall like dead weight toward the canyon floor before igniting the afterburner just above the rocks and vanishing into the ground clutter, taking the missile's lock with her into nothing. When the 2 jets regrouped afterward, Derek's voice over the radio had lost every trace of arrogance it once carried. "I'm here, Viper," he said quietly. "Right on your wing." In the debrief that followed, Derek did something none of his squadron mates expected. He stood in front of the entire room, faced Riley directly, and admitted without excuse that his decision to disobey her order had nearly gotten him killed, and that she had risked her own aircraft to save his life. It was, by every measure, a moment that changed the balance of the entire squadron. Before that final exercise, though, there was one more night that nearly ended everything, a night that tested not Riley's flying but her judgment, and taught the entire squadron something about the difference between courage and recklessness. 2 days after the canyon rescue, Colonel Ingram assigned a joint strike package, for aircraft total, 2 hunter-killer elements working in tandem to suppress a simulated integrated air defense system before a mock bombing run could proceed. Riley and Derek were paired with another 2-ship element led by Captain Sarah Whitfield, a sharp, no-nonsense pilot who had transferred in from an F-22 squadron and had, until that point, kept a careful distance from the drama surrounding the farm girl everyone was suddenly talking about. The briefing room buzzed with more tension than usual. Word of the canyon rescue had spread through the base, and not everyone was pleased about it. A few of the older instructor pilots muttered that Riley had gotten lucky, that her willingness to break protocol was a habit that would eventually get someone killed for real, simulation or not. Derek, to his credit, said nothing when he heard the whispers, but Riley noticed the way his jaw tightened every time the subject came up, as if he were fighting the urge to defend her and hadn't yet decided whether he'd earned the right to. The mission plan called for Whitfield's element to suppress the outer ring of simulated radar sites while Riley and Derek pushed through a gap in coverage to strike the command node itself. On paper it was clean. In the air, nothing about Red Flag ever stayed clean for long. They launched just after midnight into skies thick with low cloud cover, the kind of weather that swallowed moonlight whole and left pilots flying almost entirely on instruments. Riley kept her breathing steady, running through the mental checklist her grandfather had drilled into her decades earlier for flying blind through dust: trust your heading, trust your airspeed, trust the clock, and never, ever trust your gut feeling that you know better than the numbers unless the numbers have already lied to you once. 40 minutes in, Whitfield's voice cut through the static, tighter than Riley had ever heard it. Element 2, we are taking sustained SAM activity, repeat, sustained activity, we did not expect this density here. A pause, filled with the crackle of jamming. Command node defenses are heavier than briefed. Recommend you abort the strike. Derek keyed his radio immediately. Copy, aborting, coming around to support element 2. Wait, Riley said, scanning the tactical picture flooding her helmet display. Something about the pattern of the new threats bothered her. They were popping up in clusters, 3 and 4 at a time, appearing and vanishing with a rhythm too perfect to be organic. Wraith, hold. Look at the timing on those SAM activations. They're not reacting to Whitfield's element. They're scripted. Someone wants us to abort and come running. You think this is bait, Derek said, disbelief edging into his voice. I think Ghost knows we'll pull back to protect our own, Riley said. That's exactly what I'd do if I were flying his jet. Pull the escort off the strike package, force the whole mission to collapse without ever having to fire a real shot at the command node. Over the radio, Whitfield's voice returned, calmer now but no less urgent. Viper, I appreciate the theory, but I've got real missiles painting my aircraft on this end. Theoretical or not, that's not a comfortable position to be flying in. Riley closed her eyes for half a second, feeling the old, familiar tightness in her chest that used to come right before a stall, back when she was 17 years old and alone in a cockpit with nobody to catch her if she got it wrong. This was the exact kind of decision her grandfather had warned her about, the moment when the safe choice and the right choice pulled in two different directions, and there was no simulator readout that could tell her which was which. Whitfield, can your element hold 30 more seconds? Riley asked. Not retreat. Just hold position, keep your countermeasures cycling, don't commit to a full withdrawal. There was a pause long enough that Riley thought the answer might be no. Then, 30 seconds, Viper. After that I am pulling my people out whether you like it or not. Copy. Wraith, stay on me. We're pushing the last 2 miles to the node, fast and low, before whatever's generating that pattern resets. Derek didn't argue this time. He simply said, lead the way, and tucked his wing tighter against hers than regulation technically allowed. They dropped to just above the desert floor, running the final approach in near total darkness, guided more by memorized terrain than by any screen. The false SAM activations kept flaring around Whitfield's position exactly as Riley had predicted, drawing attention outward, away from the two jets slipping in low and fast beneath the noise. At the last possible moment, a single genuine threat lit up directly ahead of them, not scripted, not a decoy, but a real simulated battery hidden in a fold of terrain exactly where the fake activity had been designed to make them stop looking. Real threat, 11 o'clock, close, Riley called, already breaking left and popping a string of flares more out of instinct than doctrine. Derek adjusted half a beat behind her, close enough to catch the edge of the same maneuver, and together they threaded the gap with barely 100 feet of separation between wingtip and rock. Riley's weapons system locked onto the command node with 3 seconds to spare. She released the simulated payload, felt the aircraft lighten beneath her, and pulled the nose skyward in a climbing turn that pressed her hard into her seat. Shack, the range umpire's voice confirmed a moment later. Command node destroyed. Good work, Viper flight. Whitfield's voice returned almost immediately, equal parts relief and disbelief. Viper, that was either the gutsiest call I've heard all exercise or the dumbest, and honestly I'm still deciding which. Ask me again after the debrief, Riley said, and for the first time in weeks, she heard something that sounded almost like a laugh escape over the radio. The debrief that followed was quieter than the others, less about spectacle and more about consequence. Colonel Ingram walked the room through the full engagement, showing exactly how the decoy pattern had been engineered to peel the escort away from the strike, and exactly how close the mission had come to failing entirely if Riley's read on the situation had been wrong. She did not praise the decision outright. Instead, she looked directly at Riley and said something that stuck with her longer than any compliment could have. You were right this time, Lieutenant. Understand that being right does not make the decision less dangerous. It means you're being trusted with dangerous decisions now. That trust has a cost, and you will pay it eventually, one way or another. Make sure you're always willing to pay it. Riley nodded, understanding for the first time that the respect she was earning wasn't a finish line. It was a heavier set of expectations, and she intended to carry them without flinching. The true test came during the final exercise of Red Flag, a massive simulated strike deep into a heavily defended canyon network the pilots had nicknamed the Viper's Nest, a fitting irony none of them missed. Riley was designated strike lead, with Derek flying as her wingman carrying the simulated payload. As they crossed into hostile airspace, the enemy did something far more dangerous than jamming their radios. They began spoofing their navigation systems entirely, feeding false coordinates and phantom terrain into their displays, trying to trick their own aircraft into flying themselves into the mountainside. With her instruments lying to her and the automated collision system fighting to seize control of the aircraft, Riley made the call to disengage the automation entirely and fly by dead reckoning, the same skill her grandfather had taught her decades earlier navigating blind through Kansas dust storms. She and Derek dropped into the canyon and flew the rest of the mission almost entirely on instinct and memory, dodging an aggressor ambush along the way with a maneuver so unconventional, a stall-turn reversal lifted straight out of crop dusting technique, that it left the enemy pilot stunned long enough for Riley to slip in behind him and score the kill herself. They delivered the simulated strike, cleared the canyon, and flew home through clear skies, the exercise complete, the entire squadron's understanding of what a pilot could be permanently rewritten. Weeks later, standing on a runway that had once intimidated her into silence, Riley Hodges was handed a small patch bearing the image of a coiled snake, a gift personally requested by the aggressor squadron's legendary flight lead. Colonel Ingram delivered the news that came with it. Riley and Derek were being reassigned to a forward operating base in Alaska, where real tensions along contested airspace required real pilots, not simulated ones. Months later, in the freezing darkness above the Bering Strait, alarms tore through the cockpit of Riley's jet as two unidentified stealth aircraft approached the identification zone with hostile radar locks active. This was no exercise. The missiles in her weapons bay were live, and a single mistake could ignite a conflict far larger than herself. Derek's voice crackled over the radio, tense and ready. "They're locking us, Viper. Standard procedure says we return fire." But Riley remembered her grandfather's voice cutting through every storm she had ever flown through, telling her not to let fear make her decisions for her. Instead of retreating behind jamming and countermeasures, she flew directly toward the unidentified aircraft, closing the distance until she was close enough to see frost forming on the enemy pilot's canopy. She held her position with absolute precision, refusing to blink, refusing to break formation, giving the enemy pilot nothing to read except total, unshaken control. 10 unbearable seconds passed in total silence. Then the enemy radar lock dropped, and the unidentified fighters banked away, retreating back across the line without firing a single shot. High above the frozen ocean, surrounded by the shifting colors of the aurora, Riley Hodges finally allowed herself to breathe. She was no longer the girl mocked in a locker room for her worn-out boots and her farmland accent. She had become something else entirely, proof that instinct forged in hardship could stand shoulder to shoulder with the most advanced machine ever built, and that sometimes, the most powerful system in the cockpit was never the one built from silicon and code, but the one built from years of learning to trust yourself when no one else would. They had once called her a joke. Now, when her name crossed the radio, every pilot in the skies sat up a little straighter, because they all knew exactly who Viper was. Years later, long after Alaska, long after the patch with the coiled snake had been sewn permanently onto her flight jacket, Riley Hodges would stand in front of new officer candidates at that same training school and tell them the truth nobody had told her when she arrived, that the machine would never replace the pilot, no matter how advanced it became, because the machine could only tell you what it saw. It could never tell you what to do when everything it saw was wrong. That part, the part that mattered most in the split second between a mistake and a miracle, would always belong to the person in the seat. She would tell them about the wheat fields, about the sound of a radial engine straining against gravity 10 feet above the ground, about a grandfather who taught her to listen instead of just look. She would tell them about a locker room full of pilots who thought a farm girl had no business among them, and about the exact moment that stopped being true. And somewhere in that room, she knew, there would be at least one candidate who didn't look like the others, who didn't have the right last name or the right pedigree, sitting quietly in the back and wondering if they belonged there at all. To that candidate, more than anyone else, Riley would say the same thing her instincts had been proving to her since the day she first stepped onto that scorching tarmac in Nevada, that the sky has never once cared where you came from. It has only ever cared whether you were willing to trust yourself when it mattered most. Everything else, every ounce of doubt whispered by people who never had to fight as hard to get there, was just noise. And noise, as she had learned over the deserts of Nevada and the frozen dark of the Bering Strait, was something a pilot could always learn to fly straight through.